Hi guys, I'm Julianne from 𝘀𝗲𝗹𝗃 and today we are shading a hobby horse together. It's about these dark areas on the muzzle but also here on the throat or in the area of the cheeks. I'm also going to show you how you can make these dapples for a dapple-grey horse yourself, and I'd say let's get started right away. First of all, you'll need some paint for shading your hobby horse. I use fabric paint for this. The first fabric paint I use is called 𝘀𝗲𝗹𝗃 from the brand 𝘀𝗲𝗹𝗹. And the second paint, which I also find suitable, is called 𝘀𝗲𝗹 fabric finger paint. Why these two paints? Because these two are both suitable for manufacturing toys. They have both been tested for harmful substances and are therefore suitable for painting soft toys. So, generally speaking, the 𝘀𝗲𝗹 paint is a little thinner than the 𝘀𝗲𝗹 paint. I think this is because 𝘀𝗲𝗹 is a finger paint and should stick to the fingers if you use it as such. I usually use the 𝘀𝗲𝗹 finger paint to paint the eyes of my hobby horses because it's a little easier to apply to the felt pieces. It simply doesn't soak in as much as the 𝘀𝗲𝗹 paint because it's thicker and therefore the color is more vibrant. I mainly use the 𝘀𝗲𝗃 fabric paint for shading the plush fabrics for my horse because it's thinner. That means I don't have to dilute it so much to prevent hard edges on the fabric when I smudge the paint. Theoretically, you can also use the A-finger fabric paint for this. You just have to dilute it with a little more water than the normal fabric paint. First of all, I would like to show you how to do these shadings here around the eye. I always do this before I sew all the pieces of the horse together. The reason for this is that I will later sew the eye to this area, and if I shade it after sewing the eye on, I will have a small unpainted border around the eye, and that's why I shade this area before I sew the eyes on. But by the way, it's the same here with these dapples. I'll show you that later too. And what I'm also going to do before sewing my horse together is to pre-shade the area around the muzzle, at least a little bit. And the background is that I have a relatively long piled plush fabric here, 5 mm in total. When I sew the pieces together, some of the hairs are pulled into the seam. And then it's relatively difficult to shade those areas around the seams properly. That's why I actually pre-shade all these edges where pieces will be sewn together and where I want to have darker areas, at least when I use a longer piled plush fabric like 3 or 5 mm. I will also do this with the gusset pieces. So here with the edges of the lower gusset, and also here at the forehead gusset. This way it's a bit easier for me to shade the muzzle area evenly after sewing everything together. And as you may have already guessed, of course I also have to shade the whole inner muzzle piece in a darker color, because this piece will be sewn in here. That's why it also has to be painted a bit if you use a longer piled plush fabric. This prevents the formation of unpainted light gray areas onto which no paint can be applied because of the long hairs. Okay, so I'll show you how I do these shadings now. First of all, I'm going to dilute the black textile paint with some water. The reason for this is that this makes the paint thinner and it also makes the color application in general a little less intense. If I apply the black paint as it is directly to the fabric, I end up with really dark black areas that can't be smudged so well, and that's why I dilute it. Another advantage of diluting the paint is that you can avoid thick, hard areas that will form when the paint has dried. With a thin coat of paint, the fabric will stay soft and cuddly. And that's why I will dilute the paint with some water now. To do so, I just take this black paint here and a small bowl with some water in it. And I'm just going to put a bit of paint in there. And then stir well until everything is well mixed. And then I take the head side piece of my horse and I'm now going to shade this area around the eye. I'm going to use a sponge like this. As you can see, it's already well used. I have shaded quite a few horses with it. And now I'm just going to use the brush and apply a little bit of the paint. And now you have to be quite quick because once the color dries, you can't smudge it anymore. And now I just smudge this paint onto the fabric with this little sponge. Keep doing this until you're happy with the result. You can also simply dip the sponge in a little more water to make the paint a little thinner and therefore also a little lighter. It might help with fading the paint. If you now have the feeling that you don't like this, that for example the contrast is too hard for your liking, then you can simply go over the same area with a little white paint, or as I just said before, dip the sponge in some water, then you can wipe the paint out a bit. At least until the paint is dry. Once the paint is dry, it's dry, especially with acrylic paint like the 𝘀𝗲𝗹𝗃 paint I am using. Then you don't stand a chance of smudging it any further. The 𝘀𝗀𝗋𝗃 paints are water-based, so you can remove them with water afterwards. Another tip, you can also wipe against the grain a bit. Then you really have these soft transitions in all directions. That's the aim of the whole thing, to have nice fading edges and transitions. So I would actually leave it like this. And would now shade this area here around the muzzle and the muzzle opening. Depending on how thin your paint is, you can also simply dip the sponge directly into the paint. Squeeze out a little so that it doesn't get too wet. And just like you did with the area around the eye, now shade the area around the muzzle. I also make the shadings go up a little towards the nostril so that the area around the nostril also becomes a little darker. Okay, now do the same with the second headpiece of your hobby horse. And once you've done that, do the same with the forehead gusset. I've mentioned earlier that we have to shade that too. I just add a little bit of paint to the edge that will later lay at the muzzle. This way you will have a nice soft transition once everything is sewn together. Now do exactly the same with the inside of the muzzle. I will make it completely dark because, as I said, it's inside the mouth and we don't want to see any lighter edges there either. And of course it's also easier to paint it now than if it's sewn into the horse. Okay, and now you leave all the shadings you made to dry until they are really, really dry. For me, that takes at least a day. It always depends on how damp the whole thing was, but only then can you continue sewing, of course, because otherwise you would discolor the other pieces of fabric as well. So always wait until it is completely dry. Though you can also shade with other colors in the same way. In this example here, I use brown to shade the fur of my fjord hobby horse. I mixed the brown with a little with white to make it lighter. I also shaded with the white itself to get some more depth. If I had used black for the shading here, it would have been a very stark, harsh contrast on this beige fabric. And that's why I naturally opted for brown here, simply to add a bit more structure. So depending on what kind or color of fabric you have, you can also use a different color for making the shadings. First of all, I draw different circles on this book cover foil. I simply looked for a few round things in my house that are different sizes. So here is some sewing thread, or these inner edges of the tape rolls. And I'm now tracing all these different circles onto the book cover foil. And I'll start with this one. So I think I will be good with this number of circles for now. I used the different sizes for the circles to make the dapple pattern look a bit more dynamic and not quite so uniform. They're not all the same size on a real horse, so I hope it will look more realistic with the different sizes that I just drew to the foil, and now I'm just going to cut them all out. Okay, I've cut out all the circles and now I can stick them one by one onto my hobby horse fabric. I'll start down here in the corner and stick some circle on, and I'll start with the big ones. They'll go down here in this area, and then I'll just take the medium ones and then the small ones. I'll also mix them up a bit in between. But the important thing is that I only want to have the dapples here in this lower area. If you want the dapples more up here, then of course you'll have to cut out more circles and stick on more. But I'll just get started now, so that you can see how the whole thing works. And I've now taped all the circles to the fabric. I hope you can see them clearly in the camera. And now I'm going to shade the fabric around these circles with my little sponge and fabric paint. And because the foil covers the fabric, these areas will remain unshaded. And that's how you will get the dapples pattern. And it's much easier than drawing the dapples itself, plus it looks more natural. And I would say we just jump straight to painting the whole thing. So I've now got my textile paint here again, which I've diluted with a little water. And I'm going to dip the sponge here directly into this diluted paint and then just dab it along all the circles here and smudge it as best as I can. And now you can see really good where the foil is sticking to my minky fabric so that no paint will reach the fabric in these areas. I'm now finished with the black paint, you can see that I have a bit of a gradient in it. In other words, there's a darker area down here and then it fades out a bit here. Personally, I just like it that way, but of course you could also make everything completely dark if you prefer it that way. Then you have a bit of a harder transition. I simply prefer it when the transition is a little softer, so I let the color fade. And now I can basically peel off all the foil. And then I will have these light areas here. Personally, I don't like these hard transitions to the dapples. But as I said, that's a matter of taste. In order to get rid of these hard transitions, I will now go along here with the brush with a bit of white paint and blur the whole thing. And then I won't have these hard or better sharp edges anymore, but instead really nice gradient, which I personally like more than the sharp edges. But you do you. Okay, now first I have to peel off all the foil circles. And this is what the dapples look like once the paint has dried and the paint has been fixed with an iron. I have another little tip for you if you're using a minky fabric. Maybe you have some hard spots on the fabric that are caused by dried paint. This means that the hairs are sticking together because of the paint. You can see this quite well if you stroke against the grain. And then find the spots where the hairs are not individual but are stuck together. If that's the case, you can simply wiggle your finger a little in the opposite direction of the grain. And then you can make these hairs that stick together individually again. And then the minky fabric will get softer again and not so hard due to the sticked together pile. I now have the piece of fabric here that I want to use later to make the blaze for my hobby horse. I have already sketched out the blaze on a double-sided iron on adhesive webbing. It's a shape I made up myself. And the piece of fabric must of course be the same size as the blaze and preferably a little bigger. And if you now want to shade the blaze or give it a light pink skin color, which is very common and will look phenomenal, then you basically do the same as with all the other shadings. I mixed some pink fabric paint with water here, and now I simply apply it to the lower part of this piece of fabric so that I only have the shading in this area, which will later be close to the muzzle. This will give it a really realistic look. I let the whole thing dry first, and then I heat fix the color with my iron. And then I can iron this double-sided adhesive webbing piece onto the back of the fabric and cut out the blaze shape. You can find out how the blaze is sewn on in our main video with the sewing instructions for our hobby horse Holly. I'll link the video for you. And finally, I'll show you how to make shadings on the finished and stuffed horse. To do so, I'm stuffing the horse with fiber fill, but I won't attach the stick yet, and then I make the shading, for example, here at the throat or the jaws. After that, I take all the fiber fill out again, and put the horse fabric in the oven for 8 minutes at 150 degrees Celsius, which will heat fix the fabric paint I used for shading. This means that even if the horse gets wet, the paint stays on, but please check your fabric paint for fixing instructions. That's why I do the whole thing before I put the stick in the horse. As you can imagine, the horse won't fit into the oven with the stick, plus the stick and also the fiber fill might not be suitable for the heat. Okay, so now I will stuff the horse first and leave the turning opening open. And when it's stuffed, I'll start making all the remaining shadings at the throat and jaws. I have my mixed fabric paint here again. In other words, I've diluted the fabric paint with a little water, just like I did before. And just as we shaded the fabric on the unstuffed horse before, I'm now doing the same on the stuffed horse. In other words, I first draw this throat line here with a brush and then smudge the fabric paint with the sponge. I do the same with the jaw lines. Add the paint and then smudge it. I will now shade the area around the muzzle again, which I had already shaded before on the unsewn fabric. I will make it a little darker so that it stands out a little more from the unshaded fur of the hobby horse. Now I'm going to let the horsehair dry until the fabric is no longer wet, and then I'll take out the fiber fill and put the unstuffed horse in the oven. I've already said this before, it works really well for fixing the paint I use by putting it in the oven at 150 degrees Celsius for 8 minutes. But you should definitely check your paint instructions and try it out first, with a piece of fabric and some of the paint. I tried it with this 𝗀𝗀𝗋 plush we sell and it worked perfect, but not every fabric reacts to heat in the same way, so be sure to try it out first. And this is what the shadings look like on the finished hobby horse. As you can see, it just gives the whole thing a much more realistic look. It just looks a bit more angular. And yes, that actually brings us to the end. I hope you enjoyed my little video, and I'd say see you next time. Bye bye.